From the St. Francis Yacht Club in San Francisco, this is the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, hosted by Ron Young.
Welcome to Wednesday Yachting Luncheon. Nice to have everybody here. So many of us have started sailing, long time ago. Our speaker today first got his ride in '71 on a boat called a McGregor 26. And if you know anything about sailboats, you know that they are real fast, real lightweight boats that nobody thought would last as long as they've lasted. I once verified to a father that his kid was safe to sail in a Pacific Cup in the McGregor 26. Now that's a little boat for two guys to sail from here to Hawaii, but they did it safely, and they kept sailing after that. Both of them are now pros. I met our speaker today because he races a boat called Nancy, named after his sweetheart and wife, Nancy, and it's a very cool WYL 30. If you've seen WYL 30s, WYL 30s are a very innovative design by our own local designer, naval architect Tom Wiley, and it's got one sail and lots of complexity in shaping the mainsail on these boats, and they're faster than daylights. And Pat has been in front of me more times than I want to admit. So in addition to him having a maritime historian background, he's also a really, really good sailor. Back in '61, a neighbor brought home a box of bottles, and these bottles have been dug up in the bay somewhere. And Pat saw this box of bottles and began a lifelong interest in the maritime heritage of San Francisco. Most people don't really recognize that San Francisco has an incredibly powerful, genuine maritime heritage. It's hard to imagine a city with a greater maritime heritage. San Francisco, in fact, was named after the bay next to it. In 1848, the little settlement of Yerba Buena, which had about 600 people in it, changed its name from Yerba Buena to San Francisco, naming itself after the bay next to it. And the entire Bay Area, in fact, owes its name to the bay that we're next to right now. And in 1849, as the 49ers came in, San Francisco's population went from 5,000 in January to 25,000 at the end of 1849, and half of all the people in San Francisco came through that gate in sailboats after spending 5 or more months at sea. So San Francisco has a really great maritime heritage. What most people don't realize is that sailing into the bay downwind in the traditional westerly is a whole lot easier than sailing back out, especially if you came in a square rigger. Square riggers don't go to weather real well. They reach like the daylights, and they run, of course, super well. So lots of these ships that came into San Francisco bringing 49ers didn't leave San Francisco. In fact, there were so many ships in Montgomery Street Cove, which we now know, and which Lance Berg can show us in future WYLs, was an incredibly deep, incredibly full harbor filled with boats that were so close together you could walk from one to the other. And many of the buildings in the early San Francisco were square riggers, one-time square riggers who just didn't move. And they then became hotels and became stores, and we gradually filled all that in with cheap land that we pushed off of the hills and made San Francisco's shape change and kind of get smoothed out in the edges. So all of that history is fascinating for some of us, and especially for our speaker today, Pat. And Pat's going to show us a little bit about the ships that are buried underneath San Francisco and its bay. So with that, I want to welcome my buddy and our maritime historian speaker today, Pat Broderick. Pat.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me today. Thanks to Ron, who is a stiff competitor, and I'm very familiar with the transom on his boat. It's a very narrow transom, but from close up you can see it. From a distance it sort of disappears. And thanks to everyone who has a part in this wonderful, now Wednesday St. Francis Yacht Club luncheon. When I first started coming, it was Tuesday, I think. So all of my degrees are in English literature. I've always been an amateur historian. You can't study Shakespeare without studying the history of England and other parts of the world in order to understand. So how did, and I've been interested since I started sailing in the names of things, like how did that point get its name, or why is that island or rock called what it is? And I've researched a little bit. So let me introduce Doug Ford, sitting at the table down here, who's my friend and is helping with the technical side today, and he's actually my collaborator, so he's more than just a guy who knows everything about electronics. This talk usually takes an hour, so I've compressed it into half an hour. And what I've decided to do is concentrate on two groups of ships that came to San Francisco Bay and never left. First, the Gold Rush ships, and secondly, U.S. Navy ships. Okay, let's start with the Gold Rush ship. The screen that's up right now is a picture taken in 1849. Yerba Buena Cove is in the background, and you can see the number of ships that are stacked together in the cove. And then in the foreground, you can see some tents. I'm going to come back to tents later on. And the city of San Francisco, as Ron said, which had been Yerba Buena, is in the middle. And it's not much more than a conglomeration of wooden structures and muddy streets and wooden sidewalks and things like that. So Gold Rush ships of San Francisco Bay, another picture of the ships anchored in Yerba Buena Cove. You can see Telegraph Hill in the background with the building on it. Here is a picture of San Francisco in 1846, 47. In 1847, six trading ships called at San Francisco. In 1849, in August of 1849, over 70 ships arrived in 1 month. And that went on throughout the year and into 1850 and 1851. It was estimated that in July of 1849, 3,600 people arrived in San Francisco, with about 3,000 of those being Americans. Others came from Australia, they came from Europe, but most of them were Americans. The other months in 1849, 1850 saw again similar numbers, several thousand ships carrying tens of thousands of souls arriving at San Francisco, most of them intending to hit the hills and find a whole bunch of gold. As we know, it often didn't pan out that way. That's a pun. So what happened to these ships? I need to be quiet. Okay, I need to be closer. So what happened to these ships after they disembarked their passengers and unloaded their cargo? Because the crews often deserted to join the passengers headed for gold country, these hundreds of ships, another picture of ships, these hundreds of ships were stranded in the bay. Some of them were abandoned. About 200 were converted into warehouses or hotels or bars. Several even became prison ships. Another several hundred were broken up by wreckers. Their sails, which were used for tents, rigging, timbers, which were used to build buildings, were sold to people in San Francisco and for would-be miners headed for the hills. On May 4 of 1851, the Great San Francisco Fire burned most of San Francisco, and it burned out into these ships that were packed together, burning many of them to the waterline and sinking them in the shallows of Yerba Buena Cove. And then when the city cleared the debris from the fire, it was convenient to dump it in the nearby Yerba Buena Cove, creating fill. And this happened a number of times with the city burning and the cove being filled in. Here's a picture of Yerba Buena Cove with the overlay of where things are today. Where that brig is, or schooner I guess it is, on the left is the pyramid tower, Transamerica Pyramid. Down in the foreground is Battery and Broadway. A lot of what we think of San Francisco was water before it was filled in. Here's a map showing the location of some of the ships that I'm going to talk about today in relationship to what the waterfront looks like today. And you can see that it extended quite a few blocks in from where we now have the Embarcadero. Here's a ship map showing, this one's got 40 or so ships that have been identified and their location. You'll notice that most of them are aligned with the streets, because even before the fill occurred, the Yerba Buena Cove was surveyed, and the streets were laid out even though they were underwater, so that when the ships were brought in, they were frequently, or most frequently, aligned with the streets that didn't exist yet. Here, if you walk around that part of San Francisco today, there are brass plaques on buildings and on the sidewalk to identify where ships are currently buried under streets and under buildings and that sort of thing. And then there are other markers to indicate that. So let's go to the first ship we're going to talk about, which is Apollo. Apollo was mentioned in Frank Marriott's newspaper piece, and was a packet ship built in 1831. The ships that came to San Francisco carrying 49ers were not clippers. They were most of them were packet ships that had once carried cargo up and down the coast, the East Coast, or maybe across the Atlantic. They were mostly kind of old, because in those days a ship that was 10 or 15 years old was an older ship. They were purchased, decks were built, bulkheads erected, galleys put on, and then you could buy a ticket. $75 got you steerage. $150 got you a cabin of sorts, which you shared with maybe a dozen or more other gold miners, or would-be gold miners. If you wanted to go out and back, it was $200. But very few people, I think, bought the $200 ticket because they didn't intend to come back. They intended to get rich and find their way. And when Apollo arrived, her crew deserted. She was hauled up on the beach and became a store ship. You can see they cut a hole in the wall, in the hull, and built a hotel on top of it, and it stayed. Here's a picture of Apollo as a saloon, and behind it, anchored, is the ship Euphemia, which was a British brig that also suffered the fate of staying in San Francisco and became the prison ship for the city. So prisoners were brought out to this ship anchored off in Yerba Buena Cove and kept there. It was a miserable experience, according to what the historians say. Rats, lice, cold, damp, and everything else you can imagine for something in 1850, sitting in the middle of San Francisco Bay with no heat. Another ship that is probably even more famous than Apollo is Niantic. This is the cover of the logbook from Niantic, which currently resides in the Maritime Museum. It was kept by one of the owner's cousins. And the ship is, he drew a picture, there's the ship, and there is in the background Rio de Janeiro, because that's where he drew the picture. Most of these ships left New York, stopped somewhere on the east coast of South America for provisions, rounded Cape Horn, stopped somewhere in Peru or Chile for more provisions, and then continued their sail up the coast. When Niantic arrived in San Francisco, the crew abandoned her. Niantic had come from Panama and had earned her owners about $38,500, about $1.5 million today for that trip, and everybody left. 5 deserted the first day, according to the log, 9 the second day, 3 the fourth day, and then 2 were arrested by the U.S. sloop of war USS Warren for assaulting the captain with a knife because they wanted to leave and he was not going to let them. Eventually, about 5 original crew members remained, so the captain was ordered by the ship's agent in San Francisco to sell the ship. He sold the ship, and with the help of the empty whale oil barrels, which had been stowed in what was the hold, they tied them alongside and they buoyed it up and they floated it at high tide up onto the beach. Here's a picture of Niantic as a full-rigged whaling ship. Here's a picture of Niantic as a warehouse. You can see that a pier has been built around it, and eventually that area was filled in with dirt. And the result was that Niantic became part of the street scene. Here is Niantic with the Niantic Hotel built on the weather deck. And just down to the left, one building over, is Apollo, the storage ship that came about the same time. An interesting thing about this etching is that in the foreground, just below Niantic's bow, is a black man. California was a free state, but some of these gold seekers came from the south, and they brought their servants, in quotation marks, with them. And some of the, it's a whole other story. Some of the black servants were able to leave and become free, as they were in California. Others managed to buy their way out. But it's an interesting history point in California history about black slaves being imported by owners from the south. But here's the fire. San Francisco burned several times. 1851 was the major one. Sometimes ships just caught fire and burned. Here's a store ship etching shown being burned. And eventually Niantic was covered over. And then, about the time they built the Transamerica Pyramid, they also built the Mark Twain Plaza, or Mark Twain Park. And as they were digging, they came across what was left of Niantic. If you visit the Maritime Museum, you can see the stern part of Niantic with part of the rudder on display. You can see it's coppered. And here's another picture of the other side of the fragment of the ship. As with the other ships, with the exception of one I'll come to, when the archaeologists had finished and they had taken what they could, Niantic was covered over. So if you go to the parking lot next to the Mark Twain Plaza and park your car, you're about 30 feet atop the remains of Niantic. Here are some of the artifacts that they recovered. It's estimated that the Park Service has about 4 million artifacts that have been recovered from ships that have been excavated, and the archaeologists have had a chance to go through them. At the very top is a pistol, there's an axe, there are all kinds of other things that were recovered that had been stored in the hull, but when the hull burned, they got covered over and were left there. And also alcohol. These are champagne bottles. They're French champagne bottles, which were shipped from the East Coast to San Francisco. The upper class, the higher class in San Francisco were the merchants and the agents and the bankers, and they lived a pretty good life for it being 1850. Oysters, the latest dress fashions for the ladies, and champagne for the dinner table. Now, one thing about this these bottles of champagne, a woman named Diana's Coffin Riggs, who was a great-granddaughter of Captain Cleveland, the captain of Niantic, donated the logbook and the painting of the ship, and in return, the Park Service packaged up one of these bottles of champagne and shipped it to her back in New England. I don't know whether she opened it or not, but it might be interesting. Here is a picture that shows the relationship of Niantic to the Transamerica Tower as it is today, with just beside the tower. And here's a diorama you can see in the Maritime Museum of Niantic as a storeship and hotel. One of the more interesting ships that came in was Arkansas. And Arkansas was purchased, it was a schooner, three-masted schooner. It was purchased by a company. Often these Argonauts, these gold miners, formed a company, sort of a corporate group. They went together and they bought a ship, and they then came out that way rather than buying passage. And so Arkansas was one of those ships that a group of would-be gold miners got together and bought. And when it got to San Francisco Bay, it anchored off of Bird Rock. We call it Alcatraz. And as sometimes was the fate of ships anchoring out by Alcatraz, it drifted onto the rocks and was pulled off, hauled over to San Francisco, put up on the beach, and immediately holes were cut in the hull, and it became a saloon. And the sign over the door in the hull said, "Good, G-U-D-E, good, bad, or indifferent spirits sold here at 25 cents each." The irony, I find, is that 76 members of the company that purchased Arkansas to come to California were Lutheran ministers and their families who were bringing the word of God to the miners. And it ended up that you could buy a schooner of ale on this could be a groan, on a schooner. The original ship was dismantled fairly soon because it rotted, and over the fill, this building was constructed, and today it is, in fact, the old ship's saloon, 1851, supposedly the oldest saloon west of the Mississippi. Although there are a few other contenders who would argue with that. Okay, General Harrison. General Harrison was another ship that ended up in San Francisco, and it is a 1840 ship, so it was about 9 years old when it got here. It took 7 months, and the General Harrison was excavated. And shows you the hull being cleaned and the crew on it. It's said that when they power washed the mud out of the hull, that they could still smell the aroma of ash and wine. Because apparently Harrison was being used primarily as a wine cellar the day it burned. And again, lots of cases of wine and champagne and spirits were recovered from the ship. Here is a man working in the bow, just to give you a perspective of how large it is. Now we come to the other activity that happened with ships, and that is with the ships that were broken up. This picture just shows a couple of things I'll mention. One is in a circle, a scow. The scows were used for transporting goods between the ships and the shore, and people and other activities. And then you see these kind of fence-like shapes. Those are water lots. You could buy a water lot, but you couldn't build on it. What you could do was to buy a ship from a broker who would bring it into your water lot, and if it happened that that ship sank, it usually costs $1,000 to have a ship sink, then you were allowed to fill around the ship. Here's a scow. This scow was dug up at the site of Charles Hare's breaking yard about down by Rincon Point. And they took it away to the museum. This was the ship Candace, which actually came to San Francisco and left because it was converted to a whaler, and it whaled in the North Pacific for a couple of years, but then it became distressed and it limped back into San Francisco Bay and was sold to Charles Hare, a British shipbreaker who operated a breaking yard. And when it was excavated, they found these sperm whale teeth in the wreck. Here's a picture of Candace being excavated. And in the foreground is a stage that they used for alongside the ship to stand on or work on while they were breaking it up. Here's another picture of Candace being excavated. Actually, this ship was removed and currently is in a museum in Texas. They cut it into pieces and they hauled it to down there to an archaeological museum. Let me go back for a minute. Charles Hare was one of he broke up at least 77 ships, possibly more. And Hare was the guy you went to if you wanted to buy canvas for a tent, if you wanted to buy rope, line for a purpose, if you wanted to buy a windlass, if you wanted to buy a porthole, because they were starting now to build, particularly steamboats, to go from San Francisco to Sacramento. Or even if you wanted dinnerware, because when he bought the ship, he bought it. And so if in the galley there were plates and forks and things like that, he was kind of like a cross between Target and Home Depot of the day if you wanted to acquire some of that equipment. So that's as far as we're going with Gold Rush ships. By the way, this is a pop lecture. I'm not trying to be academic. So let's go quickly to Navy ships. The Navy has been on San Francisco Bay since the 1830s. The 4 points on Angel Island are named for officers on a survey ship. Southampton Shoal is named for Commodore App Jones' flagship, that found the shoal and got it and left its name behind, but it didn't perish there. It was also a place where ships were built. In World War I, the U.S. Navy found itself sort of short of ships. And so there was this massive shipbuilding program. And hundreds of ships were constructed as quickly as they could. One of the places they were constructed was Union Iron Works here in San Francisco. And in 1917, the keels of 8 Simpson-class destroyers were laid down. 2 of these, we're going to talk about briefly. First was USS Thompson, which has the distinction of being the most bombed, the most attacked, the most destroyed, almost, ship in U.S. Navy history. Here you can see it's a 4-stacker. You can see its pea-shooter gun on the bow. It does have torpedo tubes in the midships that they fold backwards so you can't see them. Thompson arrived to the Navy in 1920, a little bit late for fighting in World War I, as was the case with almost all the other ships that were being rushed into completion. She spent her career on maneuvers. And here she is laying down a smokescreen because in the days before radar, if you couldn't see what you were shooting at, you couldn't hit it. So one purpose for the destroyer was to race around your fleet, laying down smoke so that the enemy over there couldn't see your ships and aim at them. Another picture of Thompson. This one is in San Diego. And Thompson was part of the fast squadron that left San Francisco in 1922 on a maneuver that was going to take them to San Diego and break a record. But it was foggy. They were going through the Santa Barbara Channel to get there. It was foggy, and the Commodore in charge of the flotilla and his navigator thought they were at the entrance to Santa Barbara Channel. They were just off of Point Honda. And at 20 knots, they hit the rocks. There were 7 ships lost. 2 more were so badly damaged that they were scrapped. Thompson was lucky. She was in the back of the pack and heard the sirens through the fog, heard the horns. The captain disobeyed orders and turned seaward instead of landward and saved the ship. There was a trial, but he was let off for not following orders. The Navy is the Navy, and if the order was to turn to port, and he didn't, you know. Here's another picture of the wrecks on Point Honda. 20 sailors lost their lives. It seems like there should have been more, but it was that way. Here's another picture of Thompson over to the right with the destroyer tender. And then in 1930, the London Treaty limited tonnage of surface ships in an effort to stop Germany and Japan, for that matter, from becoming Navy powers. And as part of that, the U.S. Navy shed itself of a whole bunch of obsolete ships. And a lot of them were these 4-stackers from World War I, which were by now too slow, too lightly armed for what was happening with naval warfare in the 1930s. So Thompson was taken to Mare Island. This is a picture. And her guns removed, and she was then sold to an entrepreneur in Redwood City who towed her down to Redwood Canal, or creek, and built a restaurant. And maybe a speakeasy. It was the 1930s, and Redwood City was a little bit far away from the authorities on the boat. In 1944, the Navy needed to buy her back. And so they bought Thompson back. They towed the hulk down to south of where the San Mateo Bridge is now, and they scuttled her. There's where she is today. And then she got bombed. training pilots from Santa Rosa's Naval Air Station, from Moffett Field, from the Naval Air Station in Alameda, and farther afield, daily came by and practiced bombing by hitting. Doug, it's over here. Using among other things, M23 smoke bombs, they bombed the ship. Oh, this is a bomb. In case you're worried about it, it doesn't have anything in it. It has a hole in the middle. They put a 10-gauge fuse. What is there? Whoops, sorry. Yeah, here it is. There it is. They put a 10-gauge flare in there. They put a wire mechanism with a firing pin on the nose of it, and they put it into this device under the fuselage of the airplane, and the dive bomber would go up to 5,000 feet, I don't know, dive down on Thompson, and the pilot would push the release button, and one of these would fall down, and the observers nearby would look. If it hit the steel, there would be a big plume of smoke. If it didn't hit the steel, it would hit the water and probably not go off, and that pilot would get an X instead of an O, or an O instead of an X. That went on, so there were 10 of these bombs in each one of these, so every day that pilot dropped 10 bombs. There were 20 planes in his squadron, so they dropped 200 bombs. There were 10 or 12, maybe 15 squadrons that day coming practicing. So you get the idea, and this went on for a year and a half. So the wreckage of Thompson is surrounded by maybe hundreds of thousands of these things. A gold mine for iron ore. And as an aside here, I was a young boy at the end of World War II. I know I look a lot younger, but that's true. And my cousins who were older than I would walk around the neighborhood with a wagon, and the housewives would give us tin cans and jar lids and other things, and we'd take them to where they were collected and set them off to help with the war effort. We thought we were building battleships and tanks. Turns out we were probably building bombs like this. I don't know. You can kayak out to Thompson right now. This is a picture of the wreck. The other four-stacker was USS Corey, built at the same time at the Union Iron Works. This is a picture of Mrs. Corey dedicating the ship to her late husband, Lieutenant Commander William Corey, who in 1920, as a passenger in a Navy airplane, survived the crash, but ran back into the plane in a vain attempt to rescue the pilot. He was given an award for doing that. Could it have been the Purple Heart? Could it have been the Navy Cross? No, he was awarded a Medal of Honor for going back into the burning plane to rescue his pilot. And there has been a Corey in the U.S. Navy all the way till today. Then Corey in 1930 suffered the same fate as a whole bunch of other old four-stackers, taken to Mare Island, dismantled. Here's a picture of the noble ship. And Corey was towed up the Mare Island straight into the Napa River, and it is part of the levee about a mile and a half or so north of the Highway 37 bridge on the east side. So the next time you cruise that direction, look for what looks like a bunch of iron sticking up, and it's USS Corey. Conestoga was another Navy ship that came to San Francisco, a tug, originally a commercial tug, which was purchased by the Navy. Am I running late? Okay, real quick. Part of the Navy. Here is the crew. They had a black man on board. He was the mess man. That's another story. She went headed for Hawaii and then on to Samoa, and disappeared. Massive search. Every ship in Hawaii looked for her, including the submarine R-12. R-12 had contaminated fuel, and it lost all power. In order to get back to Hilo, the captain ordered the crew to sew together sheets, blankets, other things on board, and they created sails. And 5 days later, R-14, not this R-14, submarines in those days didn't have names, they had numbers. R-14 sailed into Hilo, the world's only sailing submarine. Here's a side scan of Conestoga because it only got to the Farallon Islands. It foundered just a little bit beyond the Farallon Island, and it was found in 2007. Convincing evidence was the deck gun, which you see up above and then under the water. And you can just make out on the left side the C and the S and the O for Conestoga. Okay. USS Benevolence, quickly. Benevolence was laid down as a C4 freighter in 1944 and converted to a hospital ship along with seven other C4 freighters because the military calculated that the invasion of the Japanese home islands would cost 1 million American casualties. So they quickly built 8 more hospital ships. The flaw was there were freighters with single hulls, but that didn't bother the Navy at the time. They just were quickly converting them. Here is a picture of, here's a order for Benevolent to go to Japan. And Benevolent was at the signing of the treaty. Everyone at the treaty got a card. This is one of the nurses on board. Here is a picture of a prisoner with a nurse. The Magic Carpet Ride brought prisoners back. She also went to China and did the same thing. She was a bikini as the hospital ship in case something went wrong. And then she was laid up. And in 1950, when the Korean War broke out, they reactivated her at Mare Island. Here she is being built. These are the nurses that were on board, wearing their 3/4 length dresses. Whoops. And now we're going to go to is the next one, Doug, is the next one in?
And first part of August in 1950, I was transferred to the Benevolence, along with many other people. Over the next week, came on board to start putting her back into commission for intended use off the coast of Korea. And on a return from our final shakedown cruise on August 25th, in the afternoon evening, we were in a collision with the SS Mary Lukenbach. It was a merchant marine tanker, or freighter, not tanker, bound for Pennsylvania. And we collided head on, and the Mary Lukenbach actually tore a hole out of the port side of the Benevolence just after the bow, a hole about 5 feet wide and 40 feet long, which let the water into her pretty fast. Many of us were in the mess hall having our evening meal, and we had no idea what had happened. Didn't know what had caused the explosive sound of the collision. But immediately the order came over the speaker system, all hands prepare to abandon ship. And my buddy Horton and I located the life jacket locker. None of us had been issued life jackets yet. And can't explain that, but we're not. So we got the life jacket, got the old World War II K-Pop life jackets, and Horton and I stood in the doorway passing them out as people came down the passageway, headed for the upper deck. And when there seemed to be no more people coming, Horton and I each grabbed a life jacket and made for the weather deck. And by the time we got up there, the ship had listed so far into the port that we could actually walk on the side of the ship. And we, along with many, many other people, sat along the side of the ship, still not knowing what had happened, because the looking back had backed off and steered around us and had actually anchored off our stern, but we didn't even know she was there. We had no idea what was going on. It was foggy, you couldn't see anywhere. We put our life jackets on. We swam as fast as we could away from the ship, and we were probably at least 200 yards away from it when we looked back, and finally she did go under the surface and was out of sight. And so we swam, and as we swam on through the night, it was dark by then, we came upon other people everywhere. We kept coming across somebody. And any time we did, we would latch on to them, and all of us would hang on to each other with one hand and swim with the other. Those old K-pop life jackets, we swore that if you threw one in the water by itself, it would sink. But they did not sink with us in them. They kept us afloat, sort of. Our heads were bobbing out of the water a lot, into the water. As time went on, the person next to me turned out to be our Catholic chaplain from the benevolence, Father Reardon. And as we were swimming along during the night, dark, couldn't see anywhere, I thought a little levity might be good. And I said, "Where you go, I go, Father. I'm going with you." So he said, "Come along." And we kept swimming, and there was a fishing boat skippered by John Angelo Napoli. The name of the boat was Flora. I'll never forget that name. And he came alongside, found by that time we had 14 people. We had one nurse and 13 other seamen and medical personnel. So when he came alongside, he immediately shut his engine and put ladders over the side so we could climb on board. And we climbed on board and got up out of the cold water. Actually, he picked up 70 people that night, our 14 and subsequently several more. And when that was all he could get on his boat, he took us to the Mary Lookaback, which he knew where that was. And with stretchers and lines, they transferred us from the Flora up to the deck of the Lookaback. But it was in the wee early morning hours. An army tug came from San Francisco, came out to the ship and picked up a lot of us and took us back to San Francisco. And I think it was Pier 32 that they dropped us off at. I wouldn't swear to that number, but it was along there. And when we got there, the Red Cross was there with coffee and cigarettes. There were 505 people on the ship when it sank. And we lost 23 out of that 505. The merchant captain lost his master's papers completely. Never got them back. Our skipper lost his right to command, but he kept his rank of captain and stayed in the Navy until he retired.
Unfortunately, Garland passed away 2 years ago. He was a great guy, and there's a lot more to the story than we can put up here. 500 souls. We know about hypothermia. 500 souls paddled around in those old Cape Cod life jackets, paddled around the Gulf of the Farallones for between 4 and 7 hours before they were picked up. That's an amazing sort of thing. The nurses I pointed out were in their 3/4 length skirts, and for the women here, remember that old Cape Hawk life jacket had a crotch strap that you put between your legs and fasten to keep it from going over your head. We don't have to say much more about that, do we? And here they are coming back. Benevolence lies, it's just about a mile off of Mile Rocks, just about half a mile south of the shipping channel. It was 70 feet wide, and the depth there is about 72 feet. So it broke water at low tide. Over the next year, several tugboats, fishing boats hit it, even though it was buoyed. So in 1952, the Navy blew it up. There were 3 different explosions over a 2-month period, and they reduced it to the point where it was 50 feet of clearance. And so if you leave the Golden Gate and you sail to Half Moon Bay or Monterey or someplace like that, chances are pretty good that you sail over the resting place of Benevolence, which, by the way, is a national cemetery, because not all of the bodies were recovered from the ship before it was destroyed. There we go. That's the end. Sorry it ran over that one rush of ships. By 1851, the clipper ships had been built. There were clipper ships in 1849, but there were more being built. So by 1851 or 1852, merchandise was being shipped on clipper ships, and if you had enough money to pay for it, you could get on a clipper ship. But there were, at one point, it's estimated as many as 1,000 abandoned ships anchored in Give Up Buena Cove or around on the other side of Rincon Rock.
So, how long did it take in those days to get from New York to San Francisco? Typical passage link, going around the tip of South America.
Well, let me say that there were 3 ways of getting to San Francisco. One, you could walk, or ride a horse or something like that, come overland. That took between 5 and 7 months, depending on a lot of things. The other way was to go around Cape Horn. Fast passages were in the 170-day range, that sort of thing.
So 5, almost 6 months. That's
at
fast.
least. Probably longer than that for most of these ships, because they were not swift ships. They were built as cargo ships, and their point was to get somewhere, not get there fast. With the stops in South America on both the east and west side, that added time. From somewhere off of South America, the route to San Francisco was to sail about as far as the Hawaiian Islands, and then come back. One big long tack out and one big long back. The third way of getting here was to get to Colon on the east coast of Panama, walk or ride a mule across the isthmus, and then get on a ship at Panama City and come north. They all had their perils. The peril there was disease, because you were walking to, at that point, jungle, and there were the tropical diseases and that. And of course, Cape Horn presented its dangers to ships that went the wrong way. It took a long time, it took a lot of gumption, a lot of reason to do it to get here.
So what was the survival rate? How many people would die in a typical voyage that took 5 months on a ship?
Well, there are only spotty records of logs that were kept from some of those ships, but usually on the logs, anywhere from a couple to maybe a dozen or so people would die on the way. And of course they were wrapped up in a piece of canvas and given a sea barrel. So you know, there were again the logs that are available for ships that got here there aren't very many of them.
And when people were aboard and got sick and got taken care of by different nurses, would the liners that brought people out here have any kind of medical accrued typically?
You mean the gold rush ships?
Yeah, the gold rush ships, yeah.
No, they didn't have nurses. They were 99.999% men whose only ambition was to get to the gold country. And the captain might have had a rudimentary dispensary of some sort with some, but generally it was no.
And did they fish on the way here? What about food? What kind of foods would they bring?
They had salted beef and pork and horse, hardtack or other kind of bread. When they stopped in South America, they would put on fresh fruit and vegetables and things like that, but that only lasted for a short time. Those who spent a lot of, who came first class, as it were, there were some tin goods that they could bring, and that sort of thing, but it was, by all accounts, a pretty miserable, uncomfortable trip. And boring, because they just sat around for days, months, watching water go by. Because they weren't sailors, they were landsmen, farmers and others.
What was the crew size on the average, and what were the size of the average of these ships?
Well, it depended on the ship, of course, but a typical full-rigged ship would have a crew of a couple of dozen sailors. It'd be the captain and probably a first and second mate. And then there would be another dozen more sailors whose job it was to man the sails and sail the ship.
Typical size ships?
Well, they varied. Again, they varied, but most of these ships were on the order of 120 and 180 feet long.
What would it cost the entrepreneur who built the ship or had the ship originally? What did it cost to build one of these?
Now, I don't know that, what the original cost was. They could be purchased, some of them could be purchased for the equivalent, at first for a few $1,000s. But then the ship owners caught on to the idea that there was a demand and the price went up. But if you calculate what you were earning by charging 200 men to pack on a 190-foot ship to come all the way around, it paid for the ship. The voyage paid for the ship, paid for the officers and the other men that had to be paid, and there was a handsome reward.
How often did ships leave and go back to get passengers? How rare is that?
The short answer to that is they didn't. Very few of these ships made the return trip to the East Coast and came back. That sort of voyage came later with the clipper ships. Noonday, which gave its name to Noonday Rock at the north end of North Farallon, that's where Noonday is, was on her fourth trip when she hit the rock, now named after her. So she had made four trips. This was her fourth, but she didn't finish her fourth trip. She made 3 successful trips, and the fourth one she didn't. Hey.
What are your sources for research? When you want to learn about the many things that you've learned about this period, where are your best sources of research?
Well, I'm a big fan of libraries. Because I'm an English major. My degrees are in English literature. So over my academic career as a student and then as a professor, I spent years in stacks. And they're my favorite place. I love them. So it's the books. But of course, with the invention of the internet, a lot of that information transferred from paper to electrons. So you could do an awful lot of research today on the internet. And generally speaking, I think if you're researching the gold rush era or something like that, you can be fairly certain that the information is accurate. I don't know anybody who's fooling around with fake news when it comes to 1849. And there's resources, library resources online, University of California, the San Francisco Public Library, the San Francisco Ship Museum. There's a lot of available stuff online if you take the time to comb through and find it.
Well, Pat Broderick, active Bay Area racer and maritime historian, thanks so much for being our guest on the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon. Thanks, buddy. Good going, buddy.
Thank you for inviting me. It's
This has been a presentation of the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.